Welcome back to the most accurate podcast here at 444 Football. As always, I'm your host, John Daigle, joined today by friend in life, John Paulsen. I, of course, am fresh off the heels of vacation. Paulsen, you are fresh off the heels of one of the most popular podcasts of the entire offseason, where you and Matt Harmon sit down in the last episode and discuss the wide receiver surface rankings overall. But today is a very important day because you and I are having our own wide receiver ranking summit for everyone.
Yeah, I think I was cheating a little bit last week, picking the brain of Matt Harmon, who studies the position as much as anyone. So it's always one of our most popular podcasts, having him on, because he and I got to go through the whole position and talk about all the values and people maybe that are being overdrafted. So I hope you had a good vacation, but I'm looking forward to talking some receivers today.
And we will do the same today, just that. Not sure how long this one's going to go. It's going to be interesting to see where we move along and discuss each tier. Before we begin, though, because we have a lot to discuss, I quickly want to remind everyone that everything we're talking about today is in our rankings via your projections. And I'll refute from time to time, give you my takes as well. But you can access those rankings by using the promo code 44 Underdog and depositing $10 as a first-time user. That is how you can get a free pro subscription to your projections, to my team previews that are still ongoing, to our Underdog Top 250 for tournaments only, for basically everything that's happening behind the scenes right now. Yes, the early bird discount at 444 is happening, but again, Underdog, promo code 444, that is the best route to do so right now, especially before August 1st. Having said that, though, Paulsen, I want to start at the top of the wide receivers list. And I don't think there's much contemplation here. I don't think there's much to discuss because everyone knows who is good and who are the best wide receivers in fantasy football. But I would love for you to tier off for me your top options with the assumption and the knowledge that the top tier means that any of the players you are about to mention, whether it be your top 3, top 4, or top 5, do have a range of outcomes to finish as the overall wide receiver 1 in fantasy this year.
Okay. With that caveat, I think I would probably go with Kupp. I mean, I have it in half PPR: Kupp, Jefferson, Chase, Adams, Diggs, Lamb. And I wouldn't be surprised if any of those players finish 1 overall. And then you're getting into Mike Evans, Deebo Samuel. I think they're pretty safe picks at 7 and 8. And then I think as far as the early round picks, Tyreek Hill's a little bit at 9. That's where you start to getting into a little bit of maybe of a risk because he's changing teams. I'm not too worried about it, but you're going from Patrick Mahomes to a Tagovailoa, new offense, new role, doing some different things. So I feel real comfortable about those first 8. And then you start getting into a little bit, I don't know if this guy is going to do exactly what I'm expecting from him with Tyreek Hill.
So to be clear, you have Devontae Adams, you said CeeDee Lamb, Tyreek Hill. Did you mention Mike Evans?
I did. He's at 7.
Okay. And those players you actually think could finish as the wide receiver 1 in fantasy over the only 3 that are typically mentioned in Cooper Kupp, Justin Jefferson, and Jamar Chase.
Yeah, I mean, when you say could finish wide receiver 1, it would require some things happening. I mean, Kupp would have to miss a couple games due to injury or something else. You know, I think the 3 with the strongest chance are Kupp, Jefferson, and Chase. And then, you know, Adams, Diggs, and Lamb, I think, are the next tier. Maybe you can put Evans and Deebo on that list. I think those guys could all potentially finish number 1 fantasy overall. I don't think it would be shocking to anyone. It just would require some things happening above them where, you know, Cooper Kupp has a setback of some sort. Justin Jefferson, something happens to Kirk Cousins, you know, like some things could happen with injuries that would throw some of these seasons off.
I still want to definitely lob Stephon Diggs out there as my favorite among the bunch. Like, I still have Cooper Kupp and Justin Jefferson ranked respectively, Jamar Chase after him. But like, if I ended up drafting, or if someone drafted Diggs over Chase, that wouldn't be shocking at all. Diggs is a top 5 receiver. That wouldn't be shocking at all, especially because we've seen Gabriel Davis's ADP get steamed over the past couple weeks. And I just want to remind everyone, I went on this spiel in one of our first podcasts together, but I want to remind everyone about Diggs' situation in that offense, and that 2 years ago, his first year in Buffalo, he was a mid-fifth round pick and actually led the league in targets, catches, and receiving yard as the wide receiver 3 in fantasy points per game from Josh Allen. And so then the next year, because we do this every year, we draft last year's stats. He was then improperly overdrafted in the mid-first to sustain that otherworldly, unsustainable production. But last year, what we saw was that even though the production wasn't there, and being the wide receiver 10 in fantasy points per game, the opportunity, the volume was actually even better last year. Considering his first year, 9% of his targets went 20-plus yards downfield, for example, whereas that number bumped up to 17%. Also still averaged 9.7 targets per game, and he led the league at end zone targets with 22. And so, although the results didn't follow, we got all the opportunity that we wanted. So it doesn't make sense at all that everyone's bumping him down as the wide receiver 5 or 6 when wide receiver 1 and 1,600 receiving yards is absolutely in his range of outcomes. So I do love Stephon Diggs. The only one you mentioned that I don't have in my top tier of wide receivers is CeeDee Lamb. And I maybe should, especially given that we know how much talent they lost. Most importantly, on the defensive side of the ball, also led the league, the Cowboys, in turnovers last year, a number that is not sticky annually. And so we expect more volume and their foot on the gas at all times because I genuinely just don't think they're as good of a team and they'll be forced to throw more and losing a lot of explosiveness from last year, Cedric Wilson and Amari Cooper included. So can you sell me on CeeDee Lamb? What do your notes say? You also just produced your terrific 99 stats article. Can you go in depth on CeeDee Lamb for me? Because I'm open-ended. I'm very open to the idea of putting him in the top tier.
Yeah, and I would add that if you're on the fence with Lamb, go back to listen to Matt Harmon talk about him. He's really high on his route running as well. So that's another thing. Talking with Matt about that, one of those things you want to be able to do is maybe find a guy in the second or third round that can produce at a first round type level so that you're able to take a couple of stud running backs or at least one stud running back at the start of your draft and still get that wide receiver production that you're looking for. And I think Lamb has that sort of upside. Now, I think he's going mid to late second round, so he's not maybe as good of a value as Michael Pittman, who might be have the same sort of upside as Lamb does, playing with Matt Ryan now in Indianapolis, and a similar in terms of route running is similar quality. But for Lamb, Amari Cooper leaving opens up the number one role. And he might have already been ready to take over that number one role anyway. They lost Cedric Wilson as well. They're bringing in James Washington and Jalen Tolbert and Michael Gallup. But Michael Gallup, they're not bringing in Michael Gallup, but they re-signed him, and he's injured right now and is going to probably miss a few games at the start of the season. So I think Lamb goes in with a really high target floor. He's one of 32 receivers in the Super Bowl era to gain at least 2,000 combined receiving yards in his first 2 seasons. So even if we kind of look at him and we're a little disappointed maybe with the splash that he made, in his first 2 years, he's actually been really productive. I just think that he's been surrounded by a lot of talent in that offense, and maybe that's suppressed his target numbers a little bit. As I mentioned, Cooper's gone. He charted very well in reception perception. And Harmon even added that he's a dark horse candidate to lead the league in targets. And I think we chatted on Twitter as well, looking at the odds for leading the league in receiving yards. He was down the list a little bit, like 10 or 12 receivers down the list in terms of odds, which looked pretty appealing to me, given the fact that his role is upgraded. He's got a good quarterback in Dak Prescott. And as you mentioned, the Dallas defense, overplayed last year. They were well above expectation in terms of how well they played. If they regress at all, then this offense could be even more pass happy than it already was. And if you look at the second half of last season, Ezekiel Elliott, Tony Pollard, their touches were down. They were very high in a neutral pass rate second half of last season. I don't know how much of that was by design or how much of it was just, the course of the games or how things were going. But, it looks like they want to throw. And, you've got a nice connection there between Prescott and Lamb.
Pardon me for not seeing the conversation on Twitter. Not only was I in the mountains, the Canadian Rockies, without reception for 3 days. But the first time I logged back on and turned on my phone around Lake Moraine when I got down back onto ground level, I saw just another fantasy football thread, and I immediately logged off again. I was like, oh, I didn't miss a thing, apparently.
I was gonna say, did you log on and see 10 threads?
Buddy, 10, don't get me started. Like, especially as you know, when you come back from vacation, you're at peace of mind and like you rethink your life in the world, and then you get back on and just nothing has changed in the world. It's like, God,
Yes.
I'm going back up and retiring in the logs again. I also want to quickly note on Mike Evans. As Russell Gage's ADP has been steamed to above Tyler Lockett and around Adam Thielen range, I don't want anyone to forget about Mike Evans. That's why he's also in my first tier of wide receivers, because we want to bet on talent. And I'm not saying Russell Gage is not talented. I think he can get there as he did last year if he's pummeled volume in place of Chris Godwin. But if you ask, let's say Chris Godwin returns after the first month and takes back his starting slot role, you ask, like, who then leads the team in targets? It's obviously Mike Evans. And the fact that in the playoffs last year without Mike Evans and Gronk, they were willing to move Evans, who, remember, historically has a very poor success rate, very poor receiving yards per game against shadow coverage in particular. He's never actually such an elite Hall of Fame wide receiver. He's never been able to separate himself when locked down man-to-man. But last year they said, okay, well, screw it. In the playoffs, we're going to force you into the slot for 28% of your routes and then force feed you 10 targets per game to get you the ball no matter what. And so that gives Evans, the most talented player on the team, a higher floor as well. And so that's why I think we should be higher on Evans. It's like a top 6 wide receiver, top 7 with CeeDee Lamb as well. Moving on, though, I'm curious to get your thoughts on rounding out, let's say, through the top 15, because this is really where it becomes dicey and prone to subjectiveness.
Yeah, and I think I just apologize for my dog barking. I think he's a big Mike Evans fan as well. Yeah, as you get into this next group, and I noticed this as I was doing the rankings, is that there's a lot of variation amongst different rankers.
Oh,
and when you get outside maybe the top 8 or 9 receivers. And I think there are a lot of really talented players in here, and there's some guys that are going that I like quite a bit that are going, 5th round. I'm talking about Deontay Johnson, Terry McLaurin, DJ Moore, who just got a quarterback upgrade. And there's players that they are maybe going behind in drafts that are, have some worries to me, a little bit of worry anyway. Like AJ Brown going to a new offense that has been previously run heavy. And I know they were run heavy in Tennessee, but with Devonta Smith and Dallas Goedert there, we're just not exactly sure what AJ Brown's role is going to be. He's very talented, but I don't know if the volume is going to be there to support his ADP. So there's some the order, I guess, in this next wide receiver 2, or maybe when you get outside the top 9 or so receivers, it starts to get some variation. And I think that as a drafter, if you like a Deontay Johnson or a Terry McLaurin or a Brandon Cooks over some of these players going ahead of those players, then you can wait on the position a little bit, grab one of those guys in the 5th round, or late 4th round, 6th round, maybe with Cooks, and really put together your receiving core with some real world wide receiver 1s available in that 4 to 6 range. And that's been something that's, over the last few years, as the league has gotten even more pass heavy, these guys going in the 4th to 6th round, we've had some real gems there. Like you mentioned, Stephon Diggs. Cooper Kupp came out of this range last year, and so did Jamar Chase. So there's always a lot of talent here. And so trying to identify somebody maybe that, like a McLaurin who's getting a quarterback upgrade, a DJ Moore who's getting a quarterback upgrade, things are looking a little brighter for them. Maybe they are going from that 1,000 to 1,100 yard range up into the 1,300, and maybe those those touchdowns spike a little bit, and they go from 4, say for DJ Moore, to an 8 with Baker Mayfield at quarterback, and suddenly you've got a guy who should be going in the 2nd round. So for me, this is the reason, with all this uncertainty in these wide receiver 2 ranks, it offers some opportunity, I think, to grab one of these guys in the 5th round well after they should be going off the board.
You just mentioned a handful of names, but are there particular players that stand out that you want to be ahead of consensus on? Let's say it comes back in the second or third round. You're at the end of drafts for everyone in redraft leagues. You're looking to get your second or third wide receiver. And you don't need to reach that far for Brandon Cooks, knowing that he does go in rounds 5 through 6 usually. And in home leagues may even go in rounds 7 through 8, given that there's no confidence in Davis Mills. So is there a player or a few players you are higher on than most, and you'd be willing to jump ADP to make sure you grab these receivers, knowing that they are jumbled up and a lot of them have mostly quarterback question marks that we are concerned about?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the third round. I think Michael Pittman's a great pick there. I moved him up to 10. Not too, recently in the last week or so, I moved him up to 10. I have him right ahead of Keenan Allen. I think that's a fair place for him. I think fourth round is really a great spot to get like a DJ Moore, a Deontay Johnson, a Terry McLaurin. Those guys, I think, are going in that range. Sometimes they're going in the early fifth. But so if you're trying to nab your top 2 receivers and you can get Pittman in the third and one of those guys in the fourth, and you've already got 2 good running backs, or perhaps you go running back, tight end in the second round, you're off to a really good start because you're getting a couple of receivers that maybe should be going around earlier based on their upside at least that I'm perceiving.
I do think the T. Higgins, Keenan Allen. I love A.J. Brown, of course, Michael Pittman. Michael Pittman doesn't seem like an obvious one, and I'm with you. I have him in my best ball tiers, the wide receiver 10 as well. He was actually the wide receiver 7 in points per game through week 9. That's when Carson Wentz had a top 6 EPA before Wentz fell completely off the rails. And so we have seen a ceiling outcome for Pittman that he can actually be a top 7 wideout with elite quarterback play. And outside of Russell Wilson, Matt Ryan, of course, was the single biggest upgrade at any position for any team for the Colts. So I do love Pittman. For me, though, I think the steal of the century in home leagues is going to actually be Allen Robinson, because everyone typically drafts via recency bias. And so no one's going to be willing to just throw last year out the window, even though Robinson the past 2 years has averaged 9.4 targets per game. And the way he run routes, the way he was used last year for Chicago after 2 years of being disgruntled in the offseason because neither side could meet in the middle to reach a long-term agreement, it just doesn't make much sense to utilize last year's stats when it wasn't the Allen Robinson of old. Matt Harmon even said so when I spoke to him a couple months ago pre-draft. And now he gets to play that Odell Beckham role, assuming Beckham doesn't re-sign. That actually allowed Beckham to have 7 end zone targets and 5 touchdowns as an inside the 10 monster over Cooper Kupp in the second half of the season. So knowing that everyone's just going to ignore Allen Robinson for his last year's stats, that's the player I think everyone should be much higher on. And you could probably even get a discount on in the 4th or 5th round of home leagues.
Yeah, and I didn't mention Robinson, but I think he's a good one to point out as a very available in the 4th round. I mean, his ADP in best ball is 48. So you might be able to get him at that 4-5 turn or even into the mid 5th if he slips a little bit. And you're adding him perhaps as your 3rd receiver. That would be excellent. I think the thing I was waiting on was to see what Harmon saw in his charting. And he did see a little bit of a downgrade for Robinson, but it was also, he was really sort of upset with how the Bears were using Allen Robinson and what sort of routes they had him running. It was ridiculously bad for his skill set. Yeah. So you look at what the only thing that gives me a little bit of pause is that we know that Cooper Kupp is the number 1 receiver there. So you don't have that sort of giant target upside that you might have with a real world wide receiver 1 like Pittman or McLaurin or Deontay Johnson. But you're in one of the best passing games in the league. So having the number 2 receiver in that passing game is not bad. And you look at what Robert Woods did prior to his injury. People think he was a disappointment last year because he was being outplayed so much by Cooper Kupp and was drafted ahead of Kupp, but he was the fantasy wide receiver 12 through week 9 before his injury, his ACL injury. And then Odell Beckham came in, and from week 12 to week 21, from week 12 on, he was the wide receiver 21 down the stretch. So if you combine their stats and prorate it, they basically scored what Michael Pittman scored as last year's wide receiver 15. So that's what I think Robinson's, certainly his upside might be even a little bit more than that, but that's sort of what we should be expecting on a per game basis from Allen Robinson. He might miss a game or two and finish a little lower than that, but he's going off the board wide receiver 23. I think I have him at 19. I mean, he's going behind Jerry Jeudy. That doesn't make any sense to me at all. Jeudy is fine as a player, but he's never performed anywhere near what Albert Robinson has performed from a fantasy standpoint. The quarterback situation is fairly similar between those two players. He's going behind Gabriel Davis, which I like Gabriel Davis to have a breakout season, but I can't support Davis at his current ADP, which I think is 20 or 21. So he should be going lower, in my opinion. So there's a few players below him or going ahead of him that he should be going ahead of. And I would even say maybe Jalen Waddle is debatable. Cortland Sutton, I think, should be going behind Allen Robinson. So I think he is a good value, and he's a good person to bring up, a good player to bring up, especially if you're like attacking these middle rounds and trying to find your receivers there, which is something I've been doing the last few years.
I also want to know if we're discussing players who have flashed their ceilings in pockets, proving to us that they can be honestly like a top 10 wide receiver. Mike Williams as well, whose ADP is already going fringe top 12 wide receiver. But I remember through week 5, before he suffered that knee injury, and maybe that's not the case. Maybe it's because of other reasons and Justin Herbert not being allowed to go downfield, which we expect him to be allowed to do more this year. But Mike Williams had a 25% target share, averaged 5 more fantasy points per game in those first 5 weeks. And after that, he just basically became a boom or bust option in the second half of the season. But he did show us that ceiling he has if it all comes together for the first time in his career. Also, Marquise Brown, an entirely different offense. Everyone forgets that he was actually, before Lamar Jackson got injured in week 9, Marquise Brown was actually the wide receiver 6 in fantasy points per game. So he did flash that he does have a top half wide receiver 1 ceiling. And now he gets to play with his old college teammate who just last year, Kyler Murray, completed a league high 49% of his passes 20 plus yards downfield, where Marquise Brown runs free and separates. So I do love Marquise Brown below ADP as well. You can get, we should reach for him, but even in reaching for him, no one in your league outside of FFPC and Underdog, no one in home leagues is actually going to pretend to see Marquise Brown's ceiling. People are still low on him. So I do love being ahead on him. To your point on the Broncos wide receivers too, it's the fact that Jerry Jeudy, who has just 3, you wouldn't think so, but just 3 top 24 finishes and 26 career games, right? The issue is that he could be in 2 wide receiver sets, but no one can guarantee it. It could be Tim Patrick across from Cortland Sutton. Cortland Sutton, of course, who was just given a long-term extension after Tim Patrick. Actually, they extended Tim Patrick first. And so I would imagine those 2 are actually the ones that are on the field and starting 2 wide sets with Jerry Jeudy from the slot. And so that's why, Sutton's ADP has finally moved ahead of Judy's, as it should have been this entire time. But that's why I'm a little lower on Jerry Jeudy in that range as well.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. The Marquise Brown conversation is always interesting because, if DeAndre Hopkins wasn't coming back, he'd be going quite a bit higher. He'd probably be going, top 15 or even higher. But with Hopkins sort of looming, and he's never been one that really has played and not seen a ton of targets. So you wonder how the dynamic is going to be between Brown, Hopkins, Rondale Moore, and AJ Green. I think probably, AJ Green and Rondale Moore sort of share that third receiver role. But they also run a lot of 4 wide receiver sets, if I remember correctly, the Cardinals. So I just wonder how much of a hit Brown's targets will take when Hopkins returns. And so that's why I'm not drafting him as a solid wide receiver 2. I've got him at 22, right around DK Metcalf and Adam Thielen. I'm pretty high on Thielen, given what's going on there. And then the Denver thing. I think you're exactly right. The Jeudy, you're looking at Judy's snap shares so far, and they're just not there to support his ADP. I mean, he had a 65% snap share last year, while both Patrick and Sutton were well over 80%. So Patrick, to me, is the value, and I do think that Sutton should be going ahead of Jeudy. Now, it's a new regime. It's a new quarterback, a new offense. We're designing it around Russell Wilson. So that sort of throws all the balls up in the air, and maybe things change. Maybe they run more 3 receiver sets, although the Packers didn't run a ton of three receiver sets. And maybe Judy plays 70, 75, 80% of the snaps, but we haven't seen it, and he hasn't finished above wide receiver 67 in a per game average in his last 2 seasons. So going ahead of Allen Robinson is just a non-starter for me. I've got Judy at wide receiver 35. And so his ADP is one that just I don't even understand.
I want you to round out your low end wide receiver 2s for me, because that range is also, you've already discussed a lot of guys, but that range with the Darnell Mooney's and terrible offensive situation, Amon-Ra St. Brown, who we have questions about since TJ Hawkinson and DeAndre Swift was banged up at the end of the season, Juju Smith-Schuster in a log-jammed wide receiver core, Amari Cooper perhaps without Deshaun Watson. There are just a lot of question marks as we get into the wide receivers, 20 through 30 range.
Yeah, and you're looking at guys that you're not 100% sure they're the number 1 receiver, or if they are, they're in a terrible offense, or they have quarterback questions, and this is what you're getting into. However, there are some interesting plays, and I think Adam Thielen, last I saw, his ADP is like wide receiver 35. I'm looking now; it's 32, so it's come up a little bit, I think. He was a wide receiver, fantasy receiver 7 last year before his injury. And yeah, he's getting a little older. He's 32 now, but the Vikings are supposed to throw the ball more this year than they did last year. And he's a touchdown maker. Everybody's waiting for his touchdowns to regress, and they just haven't. So, a real threat for 10 touchdowns plus, playing second fiddle to Justin Jefferson isn't necessarily a bad thing for him. He's not going to see any double coverage. So I like him, as a low end wide receiver too. I like Mooney just from a volume standpoint. He's got one of the highest target floors of any of these guys going in this range because of what the Bears haven't done at the receiver position. They let Allen Robinson walk. They drafted Velus Jones, who's 25. They brought in Byron Pringle. So Mooney should see 140, 150 targets easy. And even in a low efficiency setting, he's still going to be able to produce on that sort of workload. And he might take a step forward. He's in his 3rd season. He might be taking a step forward in terms of his catch rate. Maybe Justin Fields gets a little bit better, and, he'll be okay. I think he's a nice value there in the middle rounds as well. And then you're getting into guys like, we haven't talked about Jalen Waddle too much. I mean, I have him at receiver 20. He's going a little bit earlier than that. The Tyreek Hill addition worries me in terms of his floor. That could be an interesting dynamic between the two of those, and those two could be closer in targets than we think. They're both really fast players and good route runners. And then, Rashad Bateman, this Baltimore offense, he's ready for a breakout in terms of his route running per Matt Harmon. And, we saw some production last year as the third fiddle really to Marquise Brown and Mark Andrews. And now that Marquise Brown is gone, the question is with the Ravens is how much are they going to be able to throw, or how much do they want to throw? And I think a lot of that comes down to the running game and how healthy it is. So J.K. Dobbins, there's been some kerfuffle on Twitter with Ian Rappaport and J.K. Dobbins about whether or not Dobbins will be ready for week 1. Rappaport is saying that his source says that he's no sure thing to be ready for week 1, whereas Dobbins says for sure he'll be ready for week 1. So how healthy are those running backs, Edwards and Dobbins, in September, will likely drive the passing volume or drive it down, rushing volume, I guess, for the Ravens. And so I wonder about Mark Andrews and Bateman, how productive they'll be if the Ravens are successful in going back to 2019 in terms of their passing volume. They're wanting to run the ball more. So those are the question marks you get into here. I think Drake London is being underdrafted. And, you mentioned Amon-Ra St. Brown. He had all that production with a bunch of injuries around him. So it does sound like they want to run the offense through him. That's what a beat writer said. And he was super productive late last year, wide receiver 3. But before that, he wasn't very productive at all.
Harmon sold me on Rashad Bateman's breakout year. We know the Ravens have the 4th most available targets missing from last year's production. So you would think they logically fall into Bateman's lap, but also the fact that he can be a downfield receiver. He caught 9 of 18 targets, 20 plus yards downfield last year. Like, he proved he can get open. Also, per Matt Harmon's reception perception charting, the elite threshold that you want to cross against man coverage is 70%. And Bateman actually recorded 72.7% success rate against man coverage. So, like, he can do it all across the field as an alpha that is better at different parts of the field than Marquise Brown was. So I do have Bateman rounding out my top 24 wide receivers at wide receiver 24 exactly. And I do have him above, actually, Jalen Waddle as my wide receiver 25, your wide receiver 20. And it's because of the volatility you touched on. 5 of Waddle's 8 top 24 performances last year occurred without Devontae Parker. And I do worry about either Tyreek Hill or Waddle falling well short of their ADP based on who gets jammed the targets, because the wide back position is not one we want to target. When Deebo Samuel became a wide back, he not only had to depend on scoring a rushing touchdown, and for every 10 carries for the 49ers last year, he actually averaged 2 fewer fantasy points per game, 21 to 19 in the second half of the season with those carries, because he's only getting 5 targets per game. Like, if Jalen Waddle is the wide back, it's not really someone I want to target, because I also don't believe he has Deebo Samuel's 1-for-1 talent. And so I think he could fall significantly short of where he's being drafted. So I don't have much, but I do understand volatility in that, yes, the bottom could fall out, what I'm predicting, but it means also he could hit his ceiling, and Tyreek Hill is the one we're actually overdrafting. So I just keep that in mind moving along. And then also quickly, Darnell Mooney, important to note, 27% target share and Justin Fields' 10 starts last year. That was a team high target share. And I say all those to say that I have them ranked above DK Metcalf, because that's kind of where I'm at right now. On one hand, it's a double-edged sword. Metcalf had 4 touchdowns in 5 games with Geno Smith, or 5 touchdowns in 4 with Geno Smith. And you can say, yes, that's his profile. That's what he should do. But also, like, do we expect that to sustain on a 22% target share, what he had from Geno Smith, when Tyler Lockett had a 28.4% target share, team high in that span? And given that they are him and Lockett 4 to 5 rounds apart, when we don't know how they'll fare from a new quarterback in an entirely different season, that's why I don't want to bank on DK Metcalf in this Seattle offense. I don't expect to score many points or touchdowns.
Yeah, I got Metcalf at 21 and Lockett at 31. I think Lockett is one of the best values at the position. And I'm not running around trying to draft Metcalf. I think the appealing thing about him is his athleticism, and you're expecting him, if he is playing with Geno Smith, they showed a pretty good rapport last year. Yes, the touchdowns may not be sustainable, but he was basically scoring a touchdown every game with Geno Smith. So even if that drops to half, or 3/4 of a touchdown per game with Geno Smith, that's still pretty good production. I think the concern, for anybody drafting Seattle, not so much Lockett because he's so cheap, wide receiver 47, but Metcalf, taking him ahead of some guys here in the middle rounds who we like, and we know are going to have pretty good roles, is that we don't know who the quarterback is for the Seattle Seahawks. We think it might be Geno Smith at this point, but it could easily be Drew Lock. It could be changed midseason, and that sort of throws a whole wrench into whatever you're sort of projecting these guys for. And also, changing quarterbacks midseason is not a good thing to be doing anyway. It's just not good for the offense and how the offense goes from week to week. So that is the concern with Metcalf. I have moved him up over the last couple of weeks based on the fact that Geno Smith was likely moving ahead of Lock at this point. But I totally understand the concerns. And you're looking at the guys, I have ranked below him: Marquise Brown, Adam Thielen, Darnell Mooney, Gabriel Davis, Cortland Sutton, Rashad Bateman. There's some guys that we like in there with a lot of upside, and it's wouldn't be too hard to take one of those players over Metcalf, and not knowing who the quarterback's going to be.
The way I've been treating, you mentioned Drake London earlier because he falls in this range. The way I've been treating him is I have only been drafting him in best ball leagues, in particular when I don't get Kyle Pitts, which is often. We've discussed how egregious I think Pitts' ADP is, simply relative to Darren Waller and George Kittle, when no one can guarantee me that Pitts' ceiling is higher than those other two. But really, knowing how few points we expect from Atlanta's offense, I don't think both Pitts and London reach their ADP. Thus, I've been hedging the situation. Like I've been hedging Renfro, who we'll get to, and Darren Waller. I've been hedging London in situations where I don't get Pitts, thinking, okay, this is the guy that gets there if Pitts fails to miss ADP, since I've already put myself to believe in that situation for me to win my league. A player we haven't talked about at all, though, is Michael Thomas. And I'm curious to get your thoughts where he's at for you, because we are concerned about the injury, yes, but we also know in 10 career games without Drew Brees, Thomas actually hasn't had an issue since he's one of the most talented receivers in the league. He's averaged 9.5 targets and 18.5 fantasy points in those 10 career games. So where do you have Michael Thomas, and is there a tier break there, a jumble of players you would draft him over?
I'll answer the Thomas question. I just want to comment on Drake London.
Yep.
There's one thing that on him that jumps out to me is that I think he's got the highest target floor of any of the rookies this year. I just going into that Atlanta offense, they're going to be bad. They're going to be throwing a lot. Yes, it's Marcus Mariota or Desmond Ridder, but he's going to see a lot of targets. And so that can, like Darnell Mooney, that can offset a problem at quarterback or a problem with the passing attack. So I like him even at his ADP, which is pretty low, wide receiver 37. For a real world wide receiver 1. As for Michael Thomas, I just did see that news about his recovery being on track to get him cleared within camp. So prior to this report, we have not seen anything really positive about his ankle. We've seen some videos of him running routes and jumping on a box, and there've been some very mixed reactions to what stage he's at based on where he should be from all the PT guys that I follow on Twitter. And some people would call them fake doctors, but I like to have their insight as to, because these people are actually doing the physical therapy after injuries with athletes and are watching these athletes recover. Maybe they're not in the room with Michael Thomas, but if Michael Thomas is putting out a video of him jumping on a box, then he's doing it for a reason. And the PT guys are free to comment. The news that he might be cleared within camp is good for, obviously, for his stock, because that probably puts him on track to being fully healthy or near full health by week 1. Now, the one question you have with Michael Thomas is he's been out of football. He hasn't played much over the last two seasons. He does have a new quarterback with Jameis Winston, who I actually, I'm higher on than a lot of people. I think Winston's going to have a good year. But he does have Jarvis Landry in the mix now, who will always get his 6 to 7 targets per game. And Chris Olave, who we've talked about before, really talented route runner, best route runner of the rookie class, according to Matt Harmon. Really bullish on his long-term appeal. So how do these targets shake out if Alvin Kamara is also available to throw the ball to? Does Thomas see that sort of volume that he was seeing when he really didn't have much of a wide receiver 2, much of a wide receiver 3 with Drew Brees back in those days, a few years ago? So I have him right now at 36, but I'll be moving him up on this injury news probably into the lower 30s, right around Tyler Lockett, Amari Cooper, guys who can produce given volume. I don't know that I'm going to move him up real high until I see more positive reports about that ankle.
I do still like drafting him as my perceived wide receiver 2 in situations where I only get one. Let's say an Austin Eckler or Dalvin Cook or Derrick Henry falls to you at the end of the first round and you are inclined to take them, and then you miss the boat on the top 5 or 6 wide receivers. I am then willing to say, okay, in the 5th, 4th round, Michael Thomas is still here. I'm more than willing to take a chance, knowing his profile, knowing he has shown that upside, and treat him as a wide receiver 2 with a wide receiver 1 ceiling. So that's when I kind of break the bank for him, especially because the next group of wide receivers we get into, the Elijah Moores, Christian Kirks, Devonta Smith, Tyler Boyd, you mentioned Chris Olave, Chase Claypool even. Like, there's so much question surrounding all of them about their surrounding cast. Elijah Moore, everyone loves him. I love his talent, but last year it literally boiled down to, is Corey Davis playing or not? Because if Corey Davis was playing, Elijah Moore, you practically couldn't play him. He averaged 2 fewer catches per game, 5.5 to 3.5, and 5 more fantasy points per game, actually, 16.5 to 11.3, and 3 starts without with and without Corey Davis. So having added Garrett Wilson to this group now, like I don't know if Elijah Moore can withstand like two more wide receivers surrounding him. It comes down entirely to Zach Wilson's development. Same for DeAndre Hopkins. This is the range where people start asking, do I want to draft and stash him as a high floor possession receiver on my bench for the first 6 weeks? Any thoughts on the players I mentioned, plus like your other wide receiver threes you're keeping in mind?
Yeah, one comment on Thomas. He's currently wide receiver 40. You can get him in the 7th round. Now, I think that's going to change here with this last report, but you're able to get him right now as your wide receiver 3 or 4.
That's great. Yeah.
So that's I think is totally fair. Elijah Moore really showed well in the route running per Harmon. A lot of upside there, but this is still the Jets. Zach Wilson doesn't inspire a ton of confidence that he's going to make that second-year leap. He might, but there wasn't a whole lot as a rookie to really look at him and say, okay, he's going to now be leading a really prolific Jets offense that's going to be able to support Elijah Moore, Garrett Wilson, Breece Hall as a running back, and Corey Davis as a third receiver. And your split about Davis and Moore is pretty interesting because it does seem like Wilson favored Davis when they were both playing. The one thing that was encouraging about Elijah Moore, there was not a great rapport with Wilson early on, but he did get targeted 20 times by Wilson in the final 2 games back, which I would assume Davis missed. He had a 32.3% target share, 4 for 46 on 8 targets, and 6 for 77 and a touchdown on 12 targets. So that bodes well. But if Davis was out, that sort of throws, that stat into some question. 32.3 target share would be wonderful if it were to carry over. And then we're getting into that range where these, you're starting to look at some of these real world wide receiver 1s that are starting to dry up, and you get some high upside wide receiver 2s or guys that have some pretty good floor. A couple guys you didn't mention, Christian Kirk, I think, with Jacksonville. Signed the big contract, has a up and coming quarterback. If you believe in Trevor Lawrence and Doug Peterson and that marriage, then I think you should invest in Christian Kirk because he's going quite late. He's going in the mid 40s, I believe, ADP. I've got him at 40, right below Russell Gage, whose his ADP has really taken off lately. I worry a little bit about Russell Gage back half of the season if Godwin comes back healthy. And then he's going to be the third receiver there. Is he going to be able to support his ADP, which is shot up into the 6th round? So that's a little expensive for me. But like a Kirk as your receiver 4, that appeals to me. He's not the greatest route runner in the world, but he's good in the slot. And, he's got Marvin Jones he's sort of dealing with. But that's, there's not a whole lot of receiver talent in that offense. Evan Ingram got signed. But he's not a lot of competition. And they obviously gave him a contract thinking that he could be their pseudo wide receiver 1. So I think he's a good value there. Chris Olave, love his talent. You got Tyler Boyd going really late. Finished top 30 last year. And the thing I like about Boyd is that, you can get him really late, but these talented number 3 receivers are interesting. He's tied to a really good quarterback. He has double the injury upside. So if anything were to happen to either Chase or Higgins, all of a sudden Boyd is your number 2 receiver in the Cincy offense, and he's an every week start. So you're able to get him wide receiver 4, wide receiver 5, some drafts. That's appealing to me.
Boyd also, I don't think will provide weekly production barring an injury like you mentioned, but in projected shootouts, right? Like when the Chiefs play or when the Bengals play the Chiefs, for instance, those are games where, and the Bills in week 17, those are games where I can imagine you would want to start him since it is higher projected scoring affairs. The only difference is like with Tim Patrick going in that range, as we mentioned, we expect Tim Patrick to start, whereas we know Tyler Boyd won't start. So that's why I do like and prefer Tim Patrick. Any thoughts on?
Well, one other thing I'd add on Boyd is if he does have a good cornerback matchup in the slot, that's another thing you can look at.
Mhm.
So if he's playing a bad slot corner, and you think that since he's smart, they'll go after that slot corner a little bit. I have noticed that happens. Sometimes it's not foolproof, but that's another situation where maybe it's not as a high scoring game, but he's got a good matchup in the slot.
I will also note, like, Robert Woods is your wide receiver 33 in projections. And while I agree with you in that range, he doesn't really have that ADP at either Underdog or FFPC. Home leagues especially, I think you'll be able to get him around this range, around wide receiver 50. I think he will be a tremendous value. And so just remember Robert Woods, who can potentially, as you mentioned, showed his ceiling already, can potentially lead the Titans in targets quite easily over Treylon Burks, since Burks's projection and profile are extremely volatile. Like, there is no guarantee, playing only 9 snaps against man coverage last year, there's no guarantee Burks can succeed from week 1 in the NFL. He may take an entire year to develop, especially after missing mini camp. We'll have to see during training camp how he develops. So definitely keep Robert Woods in mind in this range. But also in this range, we have, just like Tyler Boyd, just like Tim Patrick, some more wide receiver 3s. Chase Claypool, we mentioned Garrett Wilson, Allen Lazard, Kadarius Toney has shown us even though it was just a flash, a wide receiver 1 profile. And your projections, as well as my tiers, are also higher on Chase Claypool. Even though I do want to mention, and I wrote this in the Steelers team preview on the site, Claypool, like, the common thought is that he's just going to easily bounce back, since Ben Roethlisberger takes all the accountability for Claypool catching just 19 of 54 targets the past 2 years, 20 plus yards downfield. But we keep in mind, like, Claypool is also accountable for that, because he only hauled in that span 8 of 25 contested catches. Like, as a larger frame with explosive profile, he is a developing receiver, and he has not been able to develop in contested catches just yet. And so it is certainly possible that nothing changes, right? Like, the 56% catch rate, everything he's produced since his numbers essentially match each other, except in touchdowns, 11 his first year, just 2 last year. The other surrounding counting stats just mirror again in year 3 because he fails to develop. Having said that, knowing his profile, I am willing to be much higher on him in line with your projections, just in case he hits, especially around his 104 ADP. Like, his ceiling is the type of player I want to chase in that range.
Yeah, and I guess I have him a few spots ahead of his ADP. He's going wide receiver 50, and I've got him at 45 right now. And I'm looking at the guys going below him. And, I think coming out of his rookie season, I think everybody was a lot more bullish on Claypool. And then heading into his, 3rd season now, I'm a little worried about him because he didn't improve much as a route runner. I think he actually got a little worse. I have to double check Matt's numbers, but Matt was not like bullish on his development in his 2nd season. So that's a little concerning. The other concern is they drafted George Pickens and Calvin Austin. So why are the Steelers, why are they drafting 2 receivers? I know they lost Juju Smith-Schuster and Ray McLeod, right? But are they worried about Claypool, or are they, just drafting some depth at receiver? So both those guys are very, productive in college. And I think specifically Austin's route running was charted pretty well at reception perception as well. And I think what Matt was saying was that Claypool would probably be best served to be a big slot. And I don't know if that's in the cards or what the Steelers are planning to do with him there. So he does have that upside as a young developing receiver. But we have a new quarterback, and we've got 2 new receivers added to that mix. As you just wonder what the Steelers are thinking about Claypool after drafting Pickens and Austin.
What about, I know you were higher on Allen Lazard. Kadarius Toney has also, his ADP has been steamed as people have been getting significantly higher on him as a potential leader in targets for the Giants. Where do you stand on these players as we round out our top 50?
Yeah, for my Packers, thinking about them and what was likely to happen is that I just don't have anyone slated for really a big yardage year. I think the ball is going to be spread around. We're probably going to have some players miss time with injury. You have Sammy Watkins, you have Randall Cobb, and you've got rookies that are going to be developing over the course of the season. So if they do develop, they may get more playing time, towards the end of the year. You've got Robert Tonyan back. So I really think this is is going to be a spread around offense, Lazard has a chance to, Rodgers has talked about Lazard as his wide receiver one. So with the quarterback talking like that, you would think that he would see a pretty significant jump in his targets. Whether or not Lazard's able to respond and produce is, questionable. We haven't seen him do it on a consistent basis thus far in his career. He looks like he is probably a real world number 2 or 3. I think he's a really good run blocker. So that's, that might bump him up a little bit when you're looking at depth charts and stuff. But is he going to be able to take on the other team's best cornerback, win, and get open? I think that's very questionable. I don't think Rodgers is going to force him the ball like he could force Davante Adams the ball, knowing that Davante was going to win the route and eventually get open, or just catch the contested catch if he's not open. I do think Lazard has the advantage of all the guys in Green Bay because of where he's sitting right now. It does seem like he's sitting atop that depth chart. I just don't see 1,100 yard season in his range of outcomes, although he could catch double-digit touchdowns without too much trouble. Kadarius Toney.
Speak on Toney and Kenny Golladay, because Kenny Golladay is 55 in your projections, Toney 50. And I guess given safer targets underneath from the slot, Kadarius Toney makes sense as the higher projected player. But also, it's been 2 years now since we've seen it from Kenny Golladay, but he still has the red zone profile of a player that could lead this team in touchdowns and thus shoot past his ADP.
Yeah, I think Golladay is really volatile and didn't play well at all last year, and the charting was poor on him. The interesting thing about Toney is that he's not a particularly good route runner, according to Harmon, but he can win in certain spots and just needs to have a coaching staff that is going to put him in a role that suits his skill set. And the nice thing for him is that we're going from Jason Garrett and whoever else they had running the offense last year, and now we got Brian Daboll, and he's got a good reputation. So is he the guy that can unlock Toney and get him into a really good role where he can produce? I mean, he's had some good games. He was targeted quite a bit whenever he was on the field. I think he was 5th in targets per route run, which is, that's obviously great. And then he was 11th in yards per route run. That's amongst the 105 receivers with at least 38 targets. So whenever he was on the field, he was getting targeted and he was producing. And just the question is, do they force him into a role that's not suited for him? But it seems like, the offensive minds there should be improved, and maybe he should be bumped up a little bit and Golladay bumped down, because I'm just not real bullish on Kenny Golladay right now in his career.
Are there fringe top 50 receivers in your projections that you are more bullish on? Sky Moore is a name that I wrote about in the Chiefs team preview in depth that I'm lower on than ADP, but a lot of intelligent people are very high on him. DeAndre Hopkins, again, for redraft leagues, it's a different approach than best ball, but comes in this range in your projections. And also Robbie Anderson, for example, getting the Baker Mayfield bump, maybe.
Yeah, Robbie Anderson's he's had a funny offseason. But,
yeah,
to talk about the guys you mentioned, I think that the KC situation, and I don't have a great feel for how this is all going to shake out. I mean, I might be looking back at Juju at 34 and thinking, wow, why was I so high on that? Or maybe why was I so low on that? We just don't know where these targets are going to go. We know Kelsey's the one constant in that offense. And then after that, what are we going off of? We're going off of Juju Smith-Schuster from a few years ago. He's still young, doesn't have a great route running profile, but can win in the slot. Maybe he gets the most. We have beat reporters saying that Marquez Valdes-Scantling was easily the most impressive receiver at minicamp, or they don't have pads on or whatever they're doing at minicamp, but he's got outstanding speed, apparently showing a great rapport with Patrick Mahomes. And then we have Sky Moore, who fared really well in the reception perception route running charting. He was a guy that I wanted the Packers to try to nab. Ended up going, I think, 9th among the receivers in this class, which was a little surprising, but he's from a smaller school. So didn't have the level of competition as some of these other guys. But you also have Mecole Hardman. So who's going to be the third receiver? You know, we think that it's going to be Juju and Valdez-Scantling due to the money that they spent on those guys.
Mm-hmm.
And then who's going to be out there? Is Hardman going to be in the same role where he's, you know, sharing time with last year, sharing time with Demarcus Robinson and Byron Pringle, and it's going to be Sky Moore and Hardman? Because if that's the case, Moore is a lot better route runner. He's maybe not quite as fast, but he's still 4.4 or something. I have some ups. You know, I think Moore has some upside this year. I wonder how quickly he's going to work his way into the starting lineup and get that sort of that snap share that we want. And I think with Hopkins, you know, last year I had him ranked, you know, lower on a weekly basis because he just was not seeing the target share that he saw the previous year. And I don't know what he's going to come back to. You know, I think he's better than AJ Green at this point. But is he better than Marquise Brown? I don't know. And they do force the ball to Rondale Moore when he's on the field. So I think he's a decent pick, but you're going to have to sit on him for 6 weeks. And are you willing to just sort of sacrifice that roster spot to get Hopkins for this back half of the season? I don't know where he's going ADP wise. I haven't drafted him, I don't think, at all. So I don't know if he's been going off the board earlier than that. But that's it depends on the league and whether or not you have an IR spot that'll take a guy who's suspended or whatever, or how big the bench is. But it's just hard to sit on. If you have a 16 or 18, you know, player league, it's hard to sit on a player for 6 weeks.
Yeah, I think it's easier in FFPC, like a Football Guys Championship draft, for instance, where you have deep benches, or if you have a 10-player bench in a home league. That's where it's easier to sit on those guys. But that's what I wanted to get your opinion on it, because the conversation is completely different in best ball. For instance, you said you didn't know DeAndre Hopkins is actually being drafted in the 6th round in best ball, for example, because that's a format that allows you, like as your wide receiver 4, to sit on him for 6 weeks and not worry about it, because you're usually drafting 8 or 9 receivers anyhow. So it's a totally different argument since you're not worried about eating those missed points. But in this range, beyond the top 50, the 2 players that stand out for me, and I'm only speaking in terms of your redraft leagues, thinking, okay, how do I get points in this range? Because these other guys, like, we have to sit on and wait, but like the first month of the season, I think players you could potentially plug and play are Devontae Parker, who I think his talent, or at least his production, what he's shown us in his career, is overblown since he has failed to finish inside the top 42 at his position in fantasy points per game since like 2019, playing with Ryan Fitzpatrick that second half of the season without Preston Williams is like the only reason he got that contract to begin with from Miami. But still, back-to-back years with at least 7.3 targets per game. So he has shown us like he can lead quite easily the Patriots in targets. And that is an offense that if you take away that tornado game on Monday night against the Bills where they only threw 3 times, Mac Jones did actually average 32 pass attempts per game in every other surrounding contest. I also think KJ Osborne is one that could quietly provide weekly value. We saw last year in 6 games that he played at least 80% of Minnesota snaps, he averaged 6 targets per game. And we expect Minnesota to play significantly more 11 personnel this year. And so KJ Osborne is a player I've also been coming away with practically in every single draft.
Yeah, I can see that with Minnesota is probably trending up with their pass attempts. They do have Irv Smith at tight end, which you would think, or he's a popular breakout candidate.
Right.
So, you know, 4 miles to feed there, plus Dalvin Cook in the passing game. I think it's viable. And then Osborne is a guy that if Thielen or Jefferson gets dinged up, we were talking about Boyd having that dual injury upside. I think the same thing goes for Osborne in that offense, where all of a sudden you have an every week starter if one of those 2 players goes down. As far as New England, that's a tough one. I mean, you know, Jacoby Myers is probably the number 1 receiver, and he doesn't really score touchdowns. Kendrick Bourne does score touchdowns, but he barely gets used based on his efficiency. Like, he should be getting more targets than he's getting. They've added Devontae Parker, who is not a very good route runner, but really good at contested catches. So do you see him maybe in the red zone becoming more of a factor? And then they obviously have Hunter Henry at tight end as their top tight end. I think it's a tough offense to really pin down who's going to do what. And they've been doing it for years now. They just have had a bunch of, you know, okay to good players. and spreading the ball around. And I don't remember a receiver there since Randy Moss that was really, a stud receiver that you could really count on every week. So I'm not getting excited about Parker. I think Myers is probably the best of the bunch in PPR formats. And then if you're in a standard league, I probably would go with Bourne, to be honest, just because he was so productive on a per touch basis.
I also quickly want to mention before kicking it to you for your final receivers outside the top 50 that you want to be higher on. I want to make sure I mention Josh Palmer, who started ahead of Jalen Guyton in 3 wide sets in minicamp. So something to monitor during training camp, since of course we want any starting receiver, especially attached to Justin Herbert. And then also Marvin Jones gets knocked, even though he was Jacksonville's only player from Trevor Lawrence with double-digit targets, 20-plus yards downfield. And he not only had double-digit, he had 23. Like, he was the only guy Marvin Jones was throwing to. Of course, we have Zay Jones and Christian Kirk now paid, who Christian Kirk especially can take away from that role. But Jones' profile is basically poor man's Kenny Golladay, and that, of course, he can lead the team in receiving touchdowns, and he's just completely forgotten about behind Christian Kirk. So I still like making sure I have and stash Marvin Jones just in case he does have a larger role in this offense. And then finally, the last one I'll mention, because it depends entirely on what happens with Deshaun Watson, is Donovan Peoples-Jones, who averaged over 5 targets per game and 8 starts without Odell Beckham last year. But his profile, he accrued 29% of his targets, 20-plus yards downfield as well. Like, that doesn't matter from Jacoby Brissett, who even from a clean pocket, as I wrote in my Browns team preview, averaged 5.5 yards per attempt. Like, to get there, Donovan Peoples-Jones, even as like an undrafted player, like a 17th, 18th round player, you have to have Deshaun Watson. But I'm okay with that because I know his ceiling if Deshaun Watson does play. And that kind of rounds out like the top 70 for me.
Yeah, and I would add that David Bell, really good route runner as well. I think he or Peoples-Jones will be viable if Deshaun Watson is playing. I just don't know about this offense with Jacoby Brissett under center.
Bell can have a floor. It may not be a high floor, maybe just like an inch off the ground, but Bell can have a floor with Brissett, assuming that he plays the slot. He can be dumped off to. Donovan Peoples-Jones, I genuinely think, will not do anything if it's Brissett under center.
Yeah, and a couple other, or one other situation that you didn't mention, guys going outside the top 50, Jalen Tolbert, yep. James Washington, and then obviously Michael Gallup. So Michael Gallup, similar situation to, Chris Godwin coming off the ACL injury. When are we going to get him back? Second half of the season can really help you. Another deep bench guy who you might take a discount on and be able to get some good games out of Godwin or Gallup later from, drafting him later in the draft. I know that Godwin's been going way early in drafts.
Yeah.
Way earlier than I would take him. But that second, third receiver in Dallas is pretty important. So looking at Tolbert and James Washington, I want to see in camp who's shining, because whoever that player is will still be, in the mix for a lot of snaps once Gallup comes back. And, the drop in snaps usually from that wide receiver 3 to wide receiver 4 is pretty steep. So, Washington was, I believe, the Blitnikoff winner in college, and he had a good year with the Steelers before they drafted Deontay and Claypool, I believe, and then just kind of fell out of favor in Pittsburgh. He can produce when he's getting run and he's getting snaps and he's getting targets. But that competition with him and Tolbert, who did well in the route running charting over at Reception Perception, in that offense with Dak Prescott, very interested to see. I've got Tolbert higher right now than Washington. I think Washington's basically free. I think people are expecting Tolbert to win that maybe number 3 job. Right now it's going to be at the start of the season. It's going to be both of them are going to be playing. It's just who's going to be remaining in the starting lineup once Michael Gallup comes back.
James Washington initially was not free early on, but then had the boot on his foot during minicamp and couldn't participate. So his ADP fell significantly. Jalen Tolbert also suffered an injury. So that's definitely a situation where I'm monitoring for camp. But if everything looks clear, Tolbert's the one I want to be significantly higher on. Sort of like Cedric Wilson last year following week 1, whenever Michael Gallup initially got injured. I will treat that situation the same and drafting Tolbert late. And then maybe, if you put in a deeper league, Washington too.
Yeah, I just want to mention Marvin Jones because he's, there's three things in life: death, taxes, and Marvin Jones outplaying his ADP.
Yep.
That's just basically been the truth since, for the last 5 or 6, 7 years. And yeah, I think he's older, but still is a pretty good value no matter where he's being drafted right now.
And finally, it's tough because it varies given everyone's draft position. But really, ideally, big picture, how are you handling the wide receiver position this year? Are you looking to make sure you have one of those players in the top tier, your top 4, 5, 6 guys you mentioned at the top of the show? Would you prefer to get a top 4 running back instead and then rattle off in that receiver value of tiers you mentioned earlier? How are you handling it?
Yeah, I think I'm approaching it in a similar way as years past. I'm probably not as determined to get a second running back in the first 2 rounds or second running back in the first 3 rounds, because I do think there's some depth at the running back position in those middle rounds. Like it's more appealing in the 5th, 6th round than it ever has been, or at least it has been that I can remember in the last 5 years. I just think that when you look at the receivers available 3rd to 6th, 3rd to 7th round, you can really put together an appealing upside receiving core with that group of, within that group of rounds, and add that to maybe a hero RB approach with a stud tight end in the 2nd round, or even if you went running back, then you hit receiver for about 4 rounds. You might have to play some games at tight end, but you can get a Michael Pittman, a McLaurin or a Robinson in the 4th round, a Brandon Cooks then in the 5th round, or maybe even the 6th round, a Darnell Mooney in the 6th or 7th round. You can get some really high target productive players with that group, and you're getting this receiving core now that has the upside to sort of match what some of these zero RB folks are trying to do by drafting 3 or 4 running receivers straight off the board. So I think that's how I'm going to approach it. I have to start getting into some of these drafts a little bit more and sort of see which RB2s I'm comfortable with there in the 5th, 6th round. Am I getting the guys I want? Because if you don't, and you're starting to play RB2 by committee, which is okay, that makes you a little uncomfortable coming out of the draft. But it's okay to do that, especially in redraft formats where you can play the waiver wire and do some of that.
And with that, I am pragmatic. I completely agree with you. I think it depends entirely on your draft position, but I am more inclined to make sure I come away with everyone would take Jonathan Taylor or Christian McCaffrey 1 and 2 for the most part anyways. But I am more inclined to take Austin Eckler, Derrick Henry, Dalvin Cook as well, and then grab receivers from that point forward, especially the values we mentioned below their ADP, which we actually have above ADP per our projections, which remember, you can get at the site using the promo code 444 Underdog. So until then, thank you for listening. We will be back next week with our running back summit, the final positional breakdown, before we then start getting training camp news and jumping back every single week and discussing how we're jostling and how we are reacting accordingly to our projections, our best ball tiers, our team previews based on training camp and preseason games. So until then, thank you everyone for joining. Please rate and review the podcast as everyone has done so kindly actually over the past month. We will see you next time.